Okay, we're going to conclude our exploration of Chapter 9 in this lecture, which again is titled Professional Ethics. And we're going to talk about the final section of this chapter, section 9.6, which is about whistleblowing. So all four case studies or scenario analyses presented in the previous section involve the actions of a single individual. And it's easy for us to assign moral responsibility to a single individual and to discuss how things might have turned out better if he or she had acted differently. But oftentimes, a product or decision is the cumulative result of the work of many people within a larger organization. For example, suppose somebody within the organization perceives a danger to the public but is unable to persuade the rest of the organization to make needed changes to eliminate that danger. Should that person go outside the organization with the information? Well, that is exactly what a whistleblower does, and a whistleblower is someone who breaks ranks with an organization in order to make an unauthorized disclosure of information about a harmful situation after attempts to report the concerns through authorized organizational channels have been ignored or rebuffed. And sometimes employees become whistleblowers out of fear that actions taken by their employer may harm the public, and other times they have identified fraudulent use of tax dollars, for example. But notice in order to be a whistleblower, someone has to attempt to report their concerns through authorized organizational channels first, and then those attempts have to be ignored or rebuffed. So let's look at an example of whistleblowing that is quite renowned. So on January 28th, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Cape Canaveral. On board were 7 astronauts, including school teacher Krista McAuliffe, who was the first civilian to fly into space, or supposed to be, because just 73 seconds after liftoff, hot gases leaking from one of the booster rockets led to an explosion that destroyed the Challenger and killed everyone on board. And engineer Roger Boisjoli was in charge of inspecting the O-rings on the boosters recovered after launches of the space shuttle. The O-rings were supposed to seal connections between sections of the booster rockets. On 2 occasions in 1985, Roger had seen evidence that a primary O-ring seal had failed, and so Roger presented a report on his findings to NASA officials at the Marshall Space Flight Center. Roger was frustrated that NASA officials were not giving sufficient attention to the problem, so he wrote a memo to the Vice President for Engineering, Robert Lund, stating that an O-ring failure could lead to the loss of a shuttle flight and the launch pad. So despite Roger's persistent efforts to get the seals redesigned, the problem was not fixed. On the evening of January 27th, a company called Morton Thiokol had a teleconference with the Marshall Space Flight Center and the Kennedy Space Center. Morton Thiokol's presentation ended with the engineer's recommendation that NASA not launch the Challenger if the temperature was below 53 degrees. NASA asked Morton Thiokol Vice President Joe Kilminster for a go, no-go decision. Kilminster said his recommendation was not to launch. NASA officials were displeased, however, to get this recommendation from Morton Thiokol because they were eager to launch the space shuttle before the President's State of the Union address the following evening so that the President could include the mission in his speech. After NASA officials expressed their dismay with the recommendation, Kilminster asked for a 5-minute break in the proceedings. And during the recess, Morton Thiokol's 4 top managers huddled away from the engineers, and the Senior Vice President Gerald Mason and Vice President Calvin Wiggins supported the launch, while Vice Presidents Joseph Kilminster and Robert Lund were opposed. However, Lund changed his mind after Gerald Mason told him, told him to take off his engineering hat and put on his manager hat, because more than half of Morton Thiokol's profits came from its work for NASA. So when Morton Thiokol rejoined the teleconference, Kilminster told NASA officials that Morton Thiokol recommended the launch to go ahead. NASA officials at the Marshall Space Flight Center prevented the engineer's negative recommendation from being communicated to the NASA officials with final authority to approve or delay the launch. A month after the loss of the Challenger, Roger testified before a presidential commission appointed to investigate the disaster. And Morton Thiokol lawyers had advised Roger to reply to every question with a simple yes or no. But instead, Roger shared with the commission his hypothesis about how the cold temperature had caused the failure of an O-ring. And in later meetings with commission members, he presented documents that supported his hypothesis, including his 1985 memo. And Roger's testimony and documents contradicted the testimony of Morton Thiokol management, and the company responded by isolating Roger from NASA personnel and the O-ring redesign effort. Distressed by this hostile work environment, Roger stopped working for Morton Thiokol in July of 1986, and 2 years later he found work as a forensic engineer. Okay, here's a second case involving a whistleblower. In the 1980s, Hughes Aircraft manufactured military-grade hybrid computer chips at its microelectronic circuit division in Newport Beach, California. A hybrid computer chip contains both digital and analog circuits, and the division produced about 100,000 hybrid chips per year. The military put these chips in a variety of sophisticated weapon systems, such as fighter planes and air-to-air missiles. Manufacturing these chips was a lucrative business for Hughes Aircraft. For example, the government paid between $300 and $5,000 for each chip, and in return for paying these high prices, the government insisted that the chips pass stringent quality assurance tests. And Margaret Gooderall and Donald LaRue supervised the testing area. The company hired Ruth Ibarra to be an independent quality control agent. In August of 1986, floor worker Lisa Leitner found a leaker, and Donald LaRue ordered her to pass the chip anyway, but Leitner told Gooderall, and Gooderall reported the incident to upper management, and Hughes Aircraft management threatened to fire Gooderall if she didn't reveal the identity of the worker who had complained. And so 2 months after, LaRue ordered Shirley Reddick, another floor worker, to reseal lids on some hybrid chips in violation of the required process for handling leakers. So we have 2 cases where leakers were identified, and Reddick reported the incident to Gooderall, who relayed the report to upper management, but again, Gooderall was told she might be fired if she kept up this pattern of behavior. And so Gooderall and Ibarra made photocopies of the documentation showing the chips had failed the leak test. And after the chips were shipped from Hughes Aircraft, the Department of Defense tested them and found them to be leakers. And as a result of this incident, the Office of the Inspector General began a formal investigation of fraud at Hughes Aircraft. And the Inspector General's criminal investigation led to a trial in 1992. The jury found Hughes Aircraft guilty of conspiring to defraud the government. 4 years later, Hughes Aircraft was ordered to pay $4.05 million in damages, and Gooderall and Aldred received 22% of the settlement, which amounts to about $891,000. And in addition, Hughes Aircraft was required to pay their legal fees, which amounted to $450,000. And Gooderall and Aldred paid a high price for whistleblowing, despite these financial gains in the end, which they didn't know they were going to get, because both of them were unemployed for an extended period of time. And Aldred and her husband went on welfare until they could find work. Gooderl and her husband had to file for bankruptcy, and they eventually divorced. Despite these hardships, both whistleblowers said they would do it all again. Right, so we might wonder if whistleblowers should be viewed as heroes or traitors, and of course, it's probably going to depend on the specifics of the case. And people, we might want to know the motivations to determine the answer to that question as well. And people become whistleblowers for different reasons. And it's fair to say that all whistleblowers are trying to bring an end to what they think is wrongdoing, and they may well have other reasons for publicizing a problem that are maybe more self-interested. But we can evaluate the morality of whistleblowing by considering whether the whistleblower is motivated by a desire to help others or harm others. So consider a person who has known about a dangerous product for years, but only becomes a whistleblower after he has been turned down for a raise or promotion. So in that case, if the disgruntled employee blows the whistle in order to exact revenge on an organization that has let him or her down, the primary motivation is to hurt the company, not to help the public. And so we would consider that person to not be a hero, at least. And another example of questionable whistleblowing is the case of employees who have been involved in a cover-up for some period of time, and then they realize that they are about to get caught, and so they cooperate with the authorities to identify other guilty parties in order to lessen their punishment or avoid punishment altogether. Right, so those are less than noble motivations, but suppose a person doesn't have ulterior motives for whistleblowing that are selfish and is doing the whistleblowing simply to inform the public of a dangerous situation or a misappropriation of funds. And then there are three general reactions to this sort of altruistic or caring for others type of whistleblowing, which we will explicate now. So one of the responses is a corporate response, and the typical corporate response to whistleblowing is to condemn it, in the sense that they will declare whistleblowers to be disloyal to their companies, and through their actions they generate bad publicity, of course, and disrupt the social fabric of an organization and make it more difficult for everyone to work as a part of a team. So in other words, if we consider this as a betrayal, you could, I guess, depending on the motivations, if it caused, and it's necessary for it to cause short-term and long-term damage to the company. And while it is the responsibility of engineers to point out technical problems, the management of a company is ultimately responsible for the decisions being made, both good and bad. And so if management makes a mistake, the public has recourse through the legal system to seek damages from the company, and the board of directors or CEO can replace the managers who have used bad judgment. And that's an alternative way to handle a problem as opposed to whistleblowing. And so, but the weakness in this response is it's a little bit too cavalier and legalistic toward the public. I mean, if people are hurt or killed, their progeny or heirs can always sue for damages, and surely society is better off if people are not harmed in the first place. And so a monetary settlement would be a poor replacement for a human life in this case. Okay, a second response to whistleblowing is to view it as a symptom of an organizational failure that results in harm all around. And so the company clearly will suffer from bad publicity, and the careers of accused managers can be ruined, and it makes people suspicious of one another, eroding team spirit. And whistleblowers themselves typically suffer retaliation and become estranged from their coworkers. They're labeled as troublemakers, and their long-term prospects with the company are dim. But since on this view whistleblowing is a sign of failure, organizations need to find a way to prevent it from happening in the first place. And some suggest that organizations can eliminate the need for whistleblowing by creating management structures and communication processes that allow concerns to be raised, discussed, and resolved. but this may be easier said than done. Robert Spitzer, for example, observes that organizations have shifted away from principle-based decision-making to utilitarian decision-making. And a characteristic of rule-oriented ethical decision-making is its absolute nature. For example, according to Kantianism or social contract theory, the end never justifies the means. And so if an action violates a moral rule, it just shouldn't be done, period, at least on the absolute interpretation of Kantianism and social contract theory. But by contrast, a utilitarian process weighs expected harms and benefits. And once an organization begins using utilitarian thinking, the question is no longer should we do it, but how much of it can we do without harm? According to Spitzer, he writes, quote, "One can see situations in which it would be permissible to use an evil means to achieve a good, so long as enough benefit can be actualized." And Spitzer suggests that organizations should return to using principle-based ethics in their decision-making. And so, of course, Spitzer here is somewhat confused in his thinking because not all versions of Kantianism need to be absolute. And social contract theory also doesn't need to be absolute. But ironically, utilitarianism is absolutist. They have one fundamental moral rule that can never be broken, whereas Kantianism need not be that way, and neither does social contract theory. But the deeper question is, well, what's wrong with utilitarianism? And the reason Spitzer provides actually is self-defeating, because utilitarianism itself is an absolutist form of ethics. A third response is to assert that under certain circumstances, people have a moral duty to blow the whistle. And whistleblowing is alluded to even in the certain clauses of the Software Engineering Code of Ethics and Professional Practice, like the following clauses: 1.02, 1.03, 1.04, 1.05, 2.05, 3.01, 6.06, and 6.13. And these clauses provide justification for whistleblowing in a variety of circumstances. But you might wonder if there are certain guidelines or questions you can ask to help you know when you should be a whistleblower. And Richard DeGeorge believes whistleblowers should ask themselves 5 questions. So the first question is, do you believe the problem may result in serious and considerable harm to the public? Second question is, have you told your manager your concerns about the potential harm? Third, have you tried every possible channel within the organization to resolve the problem? Fourth, have you documented evidence that would persuade a neutral outsider that your view is correct? And fifth, are you reasonably sure that if you do bring this matter to public attention, something can be done to prevent the anticipated harm? And according to DeGeorge, you have a right to whistleblow if you answer yes to the first 3 questions. And if you answer yes to all 5 questions, then you actually have a duty to whistleblow. So DeGeorge's 5 requirements are controversial. Of course, some would say whistleblowing is justified even when fewer requirements are met. So, for example, what if the potential whistleblower knows about a problem that could result in death or injury to millions of people, such as a meltdown inside of a nuclear reactor? And further, suppose the whistleblower has communicated his concerns to his manager, but there is not time to lobby the relevant decision makers in the company to solve the problem internally. So if that's the case, then some argue that whistleblowing should be considered an obligation, not merely a right, even when only the first 3 requirements are met. And they hold that people should be willing to sacrifice their own good and the good of their families for the greater good of society. But on the other hand, others believe DeGeorge goes too far when he gives conditions under which people are morally required, not just having the right, but morally required to whistleblow. And these commentators suggest that a person's obligation to whistleblow must be weighed against that person's other obligations, such as the duty to take care of one's family. Because whistleblowing often results in significant emotional stress and loss of employment. And so, if it results in a person being labeled a troublemaker, whistleblowing can even end a career. And so, these are the serious emotional and financial consequences to whistleblowing that affect not only whistleblowers but their spouses and children. And those are morally relevant consequences to take into consideration. Okay, so moral responsibility here is an important and related topic. So it's different from other kinds of responsibility. First of all, moral responsibility must be borne by people or moral agents like human beings. And while the 14th Amendment to the Constitution may make a corporation a person in the legal sense of the words, that's just a legal fiction because a corporation is not a moral agent. Right? We cannot assign moral responsibility to a corporation or any other organization, not at that level anyhow. And second, moral responsibility is different from role responsibility, causal responsibility, and legal responsibility in that it is not exclusive. So what are those sorts of responsibility? Well, role responsibility is responsibility borne because of a person's assigned duty. So a company may hire a bookkeeper to send out invoices and pay the bills, and it's the bookkeeper's responsibility to get the bills paid on time. Causal responsibility is responsibility assigned to people because they did something or failed to do something that caused something to happen. So we could say that Joe is responsible for the network being down because he released the virus that caused the computers to crash. And legal responsibility is responsibility assigned by law. Homeowners are responsible, for example, for the medical bills of a postal carrier who slips and falls on their driveway. Okay, well, role responsibility, causal responsibility, and legal responsibility can be exclusive. For example, if one person is responsible for paying the bills, the other employees are not. But moral responsibility need not be exclusive. For example, if an infant is brought into a home, both the mother and the father are responsible for the baby's well-being. And because moral responsibility is not exclusive, people cannot pass the buck by saying, my boss made the final decision, not me. Or by saying, I just wrote the software, I wasn't responsible for testing it. And when people abdicate their moral responsibility, great harms can be done. And Michael McFarland, he argues that a team of engineers should be held to a higher level of moral responsibility than any of its individual members, because there may be situations where a person has a duty to speak the truth, and to this duty McFarland adds another duty held by moral agents, namely the duty to help others in need. And so if whistleblowing of the sort we've looked at should be done and no individual has the strength to do it, then it must be done by the group acting collectively.